Hey everyone, and welcome to Geriatric Mom. This is episode 17, and this is the show that helps you have a voice, real moms and dads sharing the unedited truth, finding joy in the chaos, and reminding each other we're in this together. So this episode is going to be called Evolution of Motherhood. I thought it would be fun to kind of go through like the history of being a mom and like what that looked like at different times, right? So kind of see like how we got to the point where we are now versus, what used to be, right? So, to get started, I figured we'd just start off in the 1900s. So, 1900, the women were responsible for all household chores. So, that means cooking, cleaning the kids. They had to like hand wash their clothes. Obviously, there wasn't like electric appliances back then. They had to make clothes for their kids. So, they literally were doing everything from scratch, making food. There was like very little things, there wasn't electricity, all of those things, right? So the chores were very physically demanding, and they were in charge of, like the kids. um some like of the really wealthy people obviously had a little more luxuries and had people to assist with things, but in general, like the middle class, and obviously anyone like in poverty or anything didn't have those things. The mothers were responsible, like I said, for the household, which they they were responsible for obviously catering to their husbands as well as helping with all like the economic affairs. At that time, mother mortality rates were high as well as infants, so that was definitely hard on mothers when they would constantly have children that they, were born and then they'd pass away. So that was really hard emotionally for mothers at that time too, because of how high the infant mortality rate was. Um, Many kids had to leave school during those times back in the day to help work and support their families, especially dependent on, their social status. So those were definitely some harder things for the kids at that time. They did actually have formula back then, which I wasn't aware of. But especially like some of the families that were more wealthy, or even ones that weren't, it looks like I did a whole bunch of research, but they would have wet nurses. So those were just like mothers or um moms that had had babies that had passed away that literally just had milk supply, and they would feed everybody's baby. So it wasn't just like the one mom would feed the baby. There were just wet nurses that's all they did. They fed babies, which I find really interesting. Um, Low income, they had to help support. Many back then were immigrants, so they definitely had like a lower, um, you know, income level and all of those things. So they definitely had to work harder, and the moms had to help support too. Whether, what they had to do, they would help support their family in any way they could. Middle class, they were more able to stay home and not work. But in general, the fathers worked and the mothers did everything else. So the fathers weren't really involved in the rest of those situations. In the 1910s, everything was generally the same as well. There was still the lack of electricity, water, heat, etc. So those things were still very physically demanding tasks. They transitioned from more like affection to raise children to more of a scientific way of parenting, which favored discipline. So this was recommended by psychologists at the time, where it transitioned over from just like being more loving to being more disciplinary. Discipline, they thought that if there was too much affection, it led to the children being spoiled or soft, as they would put it. and they wanted to enforce more discipline and obedience. So they really wanted their children to be obedient, and so that was kind of a shift that happened during that time. Many taught school at home during this time, so they would just teach like basic reading skills and math. They were expected to maintain the home and all chores while also teaching their children and, serving and making sure all the chores were done. The mothers really took on like the complete role of managing the finances at that time too. The husbands made the money, but the mothers were really expected to make sure everything was taken care of, right? So really maintain those finances. The dad made the money, but it was on the mom to make sure everything was taken care of as far as that goes. By the end of the era, births started occurring at hospitals, so they did start making like hospital-like facilities where the mothers could go to give birth. The fathers were not in the rooms for these things. It was just, like the mothers and then nurses and doctors at the time. So it did help kind of reduce that infant mortality immediately. Breastfeeding started to be more emphasized to be done by the mother, and they really started to find at that time, like, because medical stuff was still like in the infancy, and they really figured out that breastfeeding helped prevent diseases and helped the baby become stronger. So that was a big emphasis at that time. Mothers started forming support groups to share thoughts and recipes, kind of like household ideas and kind of how they ran their household, and like tips on gardening, like how they made their gardens flourish and like different things. So they really tried to start to like support each other during this time too. Definitely seen more of like a community as far as like mothers go. The 1920s, they still continued, obviously, we know, with limited resources, but there was more like widely available. So, if you had a little bit more money, or, they started putting more things in the households to make things easier. Like some people did have some electricity, and water was easier to obtain, and some of the physical tasks were a little bit less taxing for mothers. Obviously, I don't think that was the case for some of the lower class families and everything, but definitely these started to take place more. The mothers continued to be the household caretakers during this time. Scientific, like we discussed earlier, the scientific motherhood continued, so less emphasis on affection and more on discipline and obedience. Mothers provided the moral and physical upbringing. There was still no real birth control back then. They did have some methods, but they weren't like widely available. There was still like primitive healthcare during that time, so they weren't really able to control pregnancies, and women continued to get pregnant, because they didn't have those things. So that continued on. They continued to be in charge of the finances and all the chores, like we talked about. A lot of the time, still throughout this whole entire time, they're still making clothes for their whole family, husbands, everyone. A lot of the families, unless they were higher class, didn't have the money to buy the clothes, so the women were making clothes by hand. So sewing by hand, there wasn't sewing machines and all of those things, so they continued to do all of those things. They continued to provide the basis for morals for children, so they really kind of, whatever morals that they had for themselves were really put on the children as well. And that's kind of just how they based their whole family. So whatever morals they had, they really, relayed to their children as well. They continued to lack the ability to provide healthcare and healthy food at these times, especially these, the lower class families. They definitely struggled more than the wealthier families, and it could be really hard for them to provide enough food for their family. and they continue just to really try to support as best they can. There was a lot of diseases back then, like polio, measles, were very common, so those could really, damage kids and killed a lot of children back in the day too. Childbirth continued to be hard. Many still continued to have home births, but there were hospitals available, and this is when they started to have mild anesthetics available too to try to help ease the burden of childbirth. They provided a little bit of relief for women, but it was in its infancy, so obviously there's issues with those things as well. But that is the time that these things started coming out. Those who could afford, there were early washing machines, so they wouldn't have to wash everything by hand. They still had to dry, hang dry and everything. And there were also the start of early sewing machines, which it sounded like that started more in like the 1930s, but there were sewing machines that were starting to be available, so that would make things easier for them. They started to emerge with modern women thoughts, so this started challenging the roles that they have been in this entire time, so being a stay-at-home mom, but also while trying to show more independence and pursue school and careers, while still being present in the home. So definitely more independent thoughts from women, and more thoughts that, I don't just have to stay home, I can do other things as well. The 1930s is when the Great Depression started. So if you're familiar with that at all, obviously things were hard during this time. They still continued with more modern and scientific ideas for women, and raising children continued to evolve. They faced extreme poverty at this time because of the Depression. It took the whole family a lot of times for these people to survive. So the children were working, the children were taking care of the other children, the parents were working. There was a lot of like loss as far as the men. So a lot of the women were doing whatever they had to do to try to take care of their children. Birth rates declined at this time, marriage declined, and starvation was vast throughout that time. So there was not enough food, there was not enough resources, there just was not enough for everyone. Many women began to work at home to try to help support, like I was saying, increased mother and fathers deserting their children, so they weren't able to care for them. So orphanages were full of children, and there was just children that were homeless, that were just wandering about, that had been abandoned by their families because of how severe and how devastating the times were at that time. Authority and discipline parenting became like the parenting of choice, so it really moved all the way away from like that more affectionate parenting, and really led into more of like that disciplinary parenting. Infant fatalities continued to lessen throughout this time, as well as maternal deaths also lessened, because there was still increased advancements in hospitals and technology and healthcare. So those continued to decline over time as well. There was a dual expectation to maintain the social role, the home, and the work. So the role for the mother continued to be that, they did everything at home and took care of their children while maintaining their social state, and all of those things. So they were expected to go through this horrific time and still continue the same standards. We lead into the 1940s, which leads us into World War II. This really focused on work and raising children, being involved in the community, increased parental authority, but also allowed for children independence. A lot of this had to do with a lot of the men being drafted and them going to fight in the war, and then the women were expected to, work in the factories during that time. The children were expected to help at home. So once again, older children taking care of the little children or working in factories to help make ends meet while the fathers were away. Mothers at this time became like the overall figure. So generally, like when the dad was there, they would help with everything. And at this time, the mothers kind of took over everything. So they were literally doing everything, all the household, all the kid taking care of, the working, the supporting, the finances, everything. They were expected to do it all while their husbands were off, unfortunately, fighting in a war. Uh, they had to help increase their child's skills so that they could help out around the home. They had to teach them more about, chores and working and cooking, etc., so that they could survive. They did have an increased involvement with their churches and volunteer work and organizations. They wanted to try to best support, uh, their husbands and the military and what they were doing, so they tried to be as involved as they could to provide as much support as they could. After the war, they moved to the suburbs and started families, which kind of made the baby boom that we all are aware of. So they had lots and lots of kids, which there was very large families. Um, Before the fathers and the men came home, the government did try to help make programs because there wasn't really daycares back then. So they did help subsidize and make programs for a short period of time during the war so that there was somewhere for the children to go if the parents didn't have anywhere for them to go, their children or were too little to like stay at home. So but they did eventually, like when all the men came back, they started families, and that's when there was lots of babies and the baby boomers began. The discipline increased around this time too. Most prominent didn't believe in like physical like discipline, but they were very much emphasizing like obedience and doing what you're told. The mother did have like the greater authority at that time for the discipline. So that definitely was like a big transition where they had the majority authority in the family at that point. In the 1950s, they started what we would classify as like the all-American family. Mothers began to be full-time homemakers and focus on only the household. So moved really away from, women working and pursuing those other ideas. And the goal really went back to that the mom stayed at home. They had to be very strict with the discipline. They were expected to follow any guidelines that the pediatrician gave them, which could be very hard for the mothers because they felt like they had to do exactly what they're being told, or they'd be judged or thought of as bad mothers. This did begin like some of the mothers' like anxious behaviors and feelings. Feeling isolated because they were expected to stay home. They weren't expected to go do anything else or do anything but just to focus on the household and the children. So I feel like a lot of isolation feelings began then. Motherhood was thought to be a full-time job, and there wasn't time for anything else, that was their job. Childcare, very strict, like I said, with the routines and what they were expected to do. Tough love continued to be the main choice of parenting at this time, but they did allow for some emotional support by the parents. So very obedient, but they'd also have conversations with the children, like why are they doing this and what the expectation is. Did not encourage self-expression. So still allowing you to like discuss with the children and the parents, but not for like for you to self-express what you wanted. You're still going to do what your parents want, is what they expected at the time. The moms and wives were expected to be perfect. So they were expected to look perfect. They were expected to act perfect, to have the perfect household, and definitely This is when the emphasis of a nuclear suburban family occurred. Working moms were frowned upon, and childcare was very limited, so that really wasn't a thing at this point. Pretty much all of those daycare centers had went away again, and you were expected to stay home and the fathers to provide, for the family while the mother did everything else. Pregnancy and childbirth weren't discussed at all. So it was supposed to be private, and which led to a lot of women not understanding kind of what was going to be expected of them as they got older. And for their children, they didn't have those conversations. So that would have definitely been difficult. Definitely, they were said that those were private things and they didn't discuss them. 1960s, traditional focus on domestic roles, but more women did start to work again. Challenges began to reflect issues balancing work and home life. So then the struggle became, still meeting all your obligations at home while also working. So then it becomes like there's not enough hours in a day. Emphasis was still placed on that the mothers should stay home, and it was still, mothers who did work were looked down upon because they were thought that they should still be in the home. Single moms were looked down upon, obviously, like we were talking about. That was supposed to be a private thing. You were supposed to be married, all of these things. So single mothers really struggled at this time as well. Fathers remained the sole providers, so that would be a lot of stress on them because they were expected to provide for their families. Childcare became an issue as more mothers left the home to start to work. So at that time, some of the mothers still worked at home, but a lot of them started to actually move into the communities to work, and childcare became an issue. At this time, that's when Head Start began. I feel like we've all kind of heard about that, but it was a government program to help kind of dissolve this issue. So help get the kids, to where they needed to be while the moms went and worked. The mom was still responsible for a lot of the house chores, making sure the expenses were taken care of and that their children were still taken care of, but they were entering back into the workforce. Women began to want their own careers, their own incomes, and independence again. So you see like the reemergence of all of those thoughts and feelings that they really wanted to pursue their own careers and kind of have their own identity and not just to be a mom. Men at this time were also expected to conform to society and roles. So one of the things that I found interesting when I was doing my research is that men weren't allowed to be in the room when like their wives would be breastfeeding, which I thought was really interesting considering, that they're the fathers of the babies, but they are also not in the rooms at these times either when their babies were being born. So definitely a huge societal change from now, but back then they weren't allowed to be in the rooms when they were breastfeeding either. Then we enter in the 1970s. So the rigid rules continued. The mother remains the main caregiver, but many women continued to stay home a lot at that time, but there were also, like we said, just more and more over time entering the workforce and really wanting to expand their life. Many women at this time did get cars, which they didn't have before, so they didn't have that transport and couldn't really go anywhere. At this time, they started to get more vehicles, and they would do a lot more of like the errands and taking the kids to school, and having the ability to do more throughout the day because they did have that transportation. They raised kids with less supervision. So they were still expected to play and do all of those things, and they took care of their kids, but they also expected them to do a little more self play. So play with toys, play outside, kind of. And they really trusted their kids to do these things too. Like we trust you to go play and do all of these things. At this time, the expectation was still that the dads were the sole providers and that they provide for families. There was less emphasis on having things. So the more the less you had, the more you had, right? So they wanted life to be a little more simple at this point. Men became more involved with the kids, though. So the expectation was that they helped more with the kids and that they were there to help with more of the discipline and really helping form the well-roundedness of the children. There was still poor daycare availability, and it became really hard for families in general to balance the work in the family. Breastfeeding became more emphasized through this time. Formula continued throughout this entire time, and that was a lot of what people used, and cow's milk. But at this time, they really started to emphasize breastfeeding and not bottle feeding, and I kind of put it on the mother's like self-worth, whether you breastfed or you didn't breastfeed. Living standards, like I said, were simple. They started to have more family meals at home. So like actually having like family meals, like before, throughout different eras in time, obviously, though, that was a big thing to have family meals, and that's when you ate. But throughout time and intermittently, going through like the Great Depression and different things, that wasn't possible. So that kind of left for a little while, and then it reemerged at this time, having like night-ins at home and really having like that family time. One of the issues that women started to face entering back into the workforce was there was no maternity leave. So they faced discrimination and had very little legal laws to kind of help them with those things. So they were expected to go right back to work, and they would lose their jobs if they became pregnant and all of those things. So that was definitely seemed like a really huge issue in the 1970s. In the 1980s, there became a really high concentration of women in the workforce. So there was a greater shift to independence and autonomy for women. Lots of baby products started to emerge at this time. There was less rigid child schedules, so it wasn't expected like, 9 a.m. the kid does this, 10 a.m. the kid does this. It was like a little more freedom, and, both parents were more involved in the day-to-day activities of kids. The demand for childcare was really high, so that definitely started to boom more as well. More daycare centers, more private home centers too. Children really explored during this time too. The children were really allowed to have like their independence. Like when you see the movies when kids, are out playing by the river and they're jumping in and they're riding their bikes and doing all those things. That's kind of what they're talking about. They really gave their kids that autonomy to go and self-play and explore. Um, Children had to help with the home via chores, so it was the expectation that they do these chores while both parents worked. Children and siblings experienced more teamwork, so they are expected to really work together to get those chores done, uh, which I think is funny. Definitely, probably good to kind of get that siblings to work together a little more. Johnson came out with No More Tears shampoo at this time. Pampers started, which are obviously still staples to this day. But this is when they started to emerge, is in the 1980s. This is kind of when the first computers and video games came out, so there started to be more entertainment as well. The trust for kids to be independent was very high during this time. There was more emphasis on listening to your children while they were still disciplined, but definitely involving them more in a conversation versus just disciplining. Allowing for kids to have more unique expressions and needs versus before where they were just expected to be obedient and do as they're told. More shared responsibility by the parents. So you see a lot more like moms and dads doing things versus, one having one role, really working together in more of a teamwork situation. So we enter into the 1990s, which is like more of the new age with traditional expectations. So discipline continued, but with less like with more discussions, but they also said that this is when spanking was the highest, that this like reemerged, and that was like a big thing, was spanking your children then, and that was part of the discipline. Mothers were high in the workforce, so they were full out there in the workforce working, and their husbands were working as well. Issues between stay-at-home moms versus working moms really became an issue, where they would call these like stay-at-home mom versus working mom wars, and they would just fight each other on who was better and which is best and who is the better parent, and it just sounded terrible, to be honest. It really emerged with like internet access and allowed for more opinions to be placed throughout the world, and definitely caused some tension there. Social debates were high, like I was saying. So, society hard on working moms, that they should be home versus not be home. And it was just a lot of back and forth. Helicopter parenting reemerged. So, there was a shift to where you started not allowing your kids to be as independent and wanting them to be home more and being more concerned about where they were going and what they were doing. So that definitely started that whole trend of not allowing like your kid to walk to school and being by themselves, and that's definitely where the reemergence of that came through. They did emphasize like less screen time this time, and really screen time, sorry, spend more time outside and playing. Cable TV did start around this time, and early game consoles, and they really saw high rates of like family nights at this time, because that's when Blockbuster came out. So they said that it was really high rates of like people renting a video from Blockbuster on Friday nights and ordering a pizza from Pizza Hut. That was like a huge thing through the 1990s. And I actually remember that as a child too. We definitely did a lot of that. There was still no social media at this time, so I feel like that's a somewhat of a good thing, right? Parenting books, family friend advice were huge at this time. They definitely like a lot of self-reliance on those things to try to help with parenting, and we didn't have the internet to kind of tell us everything that they need to do. So that was big through the 1990s. Throughout, obviously, mothers are full in the workforce. So then we get to the 2000s to present, right? So we began to have older mothers, so mothers having children later in life because they're going to school first. They're trying to meet increased social and economic pressures. There's also a rise, and this is with men as well. But a lot of more mental health challenges. So people aren't having kids as young, they're not getting married, they're not having children. Definitely birth is on the decline over time. Social media has been huge, and there's positives and negatives with that, right? So, a lot of like, I do this is mine, this is right, this is wrong, and that causes a lot of anxious behaviors, and a lot of self-scrutiny between mothers. Fluctuating workforce. So we've seen a lot of reemergence of stay-at-home moms, and definitely thinking that that's the better versus the moms working. But we're also in a day and age where I don't feel like very many families can have only one person work. It has to be a team effort with the cost of everything. So both mom and dads have to work. But there is a lot of reemergence that staying at home with kids is definitely positive in some areas and stuff. But like you said, like the economic stress and the recession that we had previously and everything definitely caused like a financial strain, and it's not as possible anymore to have like one parent versus another just work. There continues to just be different parenting styles. There's a new, what they call like intensive mothering. So it's where like the mothers are child centered, so they're emotionally, financially, physically labor intensive. So everything about their children, they are trying to follow through on every single thing to take care of their kids. We're seeing more kids be taught at home versus going to schools. There's like a whole shift in how mothers and fathers kind of relate. Like Chris and I, like I said, I feel like we're more like a team. Like we do things together. We do a lot of parenting of Odin together. There isn't like really one role versus the other. It's kind of like I like to clean more, he likes to cook more, but he stays home, I stay home. So it's a lot more teamwork, and definitely trying to figure out how to do that together. Um, there's been a loss of independence for kids, so obviously over time we see more incidents of kidnappings, and then as time has went on, we're obviously more familiar with like sex trafficking and different things like that are horrible. So we're seeing parents not want to let their kids be as independent, right? Because you're scared. You don't want them to go out. You don't want them to get hurt. You don't want anything like that to happen. So definitely really trying to protect them and keep anything bad from happening to them. You're seeing like that loss of independence for children, just trying to keep your kids safe. Social media, like we were talking about, is huge. There's supportive communities, which can be really great. There's one for dads, there's one for mothers, there's C-sections, there's pumping, there's breastfeeding, there's formula feeding, there's single fathers, there's single mothers, there's all kinds of support groups, which is great. So I feel like that part of social media is a really positive effect, but then there's also like the unrealistic comparisons, right? So you're going to look at yourself and like, why haven't I lost the weight yet? She looks great. She's doing this. She pumps more. She makes more milk than I do. She does this for her kids, so she must be a better mom. Or, like vice versa with dads. Like you're seeing all these things, and it's just causing like unrealistic comparisons between all of it too. Maternal mental health just over time. I feel like this is for fathers as well. We'll do a whole segment on fathers, but mother mental health is not what it used to be either. Definitely more issues with like postpartum depression, and more issues during like pregnancy with like anxiety and stuff like that. That's definitely been more prominent. And I'm guessing partly is because we allow people to express their needs and those things, versus probably back in the day that wasn't, allowed or thought of or anything like that. So now, people are speaking out more and asking for help. So that's definitely probably a huge part of that. But over time, it's just like the change in society for how things work. Now I feel like it's more, parents talk through things more than it's not okay to, spank your kids and do all of those things. So definitely a lot more emphasis on allowing uniqueness and individuality, and really having discussions, versus like punishment. And I feel like there's good and bad with all of it, right? So it's just, I think it's interesting to discuss things like this, just to like see the evolution over time of like things that have worked and haven't worked. And to me, it's kind of like, how do we take all these little bits and pieces of things that have worked over time and could continue to work now to just make like the best possible outcome, right? So that's definitely my goal as a parent, is I look at all of these things and I try to take in little bits and pieces of everything, and things from my childhood, and figure out, what parenting style works the best for me, and how, my expectations of my child are, and what I want that to look like. So I just think it's really interesting to go through things like this and just kind of see how things evolve over time. I definitely think we all need to continue to support each other. If you need anyone or would like to discuss further, you can definitely reach out to me. I'm on Facebook, YouTube, TikTok, Instagram. I have my own website, www.geriatric-mom.com. Always happy to kind of like discuss these things. I'm always open to thoughts and ideas, different things and concerns and different things like that. So once again, thanks for listening to Geriatric Mom, and we will talk soon. Thanks for listening.